The fluorescent lights in the executive boardroom cast sharp shadows across polished mahogany as Margaret Ellis pushed her janitor's cart past the glass walls. She could see them inside, 12 executives in tailored suits, leaning back in leather chairs worth more than her monthly rent. They never looked at her. To them, she was part of the furniture, invisible as the air conditioning that kept their million-dollar decisions cool and comfortable. But that was about to change. Margaret had been cleaning TechVantage Tower for 17 years. 17 years of scrubbing the same marble floors, emptying the same trash bins, wiping the same fingerprints off glass doors that executives pushed through without a single glance in her direction. She knew every corner of the 53rd floor better than anyone who worked there. She knew which conference room always had coffee stains on the table, which bathroom sink dripped at 4 a.m., which window wouldn't close properly during winter storms. She also knew things people said when they thought no one was listening. This particular morning started like any other. Margaret arrived at 5:30 a.m., her cart loaded with cleaning supplies, her back already aching from the bus ride across town. The building was silent, except for the hum of computers left running overnight and the distant whir of the HVAC system. She moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, lobby first, then the bathrooms, then the maze of cubicles where junior employees spent their days staring at screens. By 7:45 a.m. she reached the executive floor. That's when she heard the shouting. Richard Caldwell built TechVantage from nothing. That's what the plaques in the lobby said, what the business magazines printed, what he reminded his board members every quarter when they questioned his decisions. He started with a single patent for cloud infrastructure technology and turned it into a $7 billion empire. Forbes called him a visionary, Wall Street called him ruthless. His employees called him, behind closed doors, many things that never made it into press releases. Richard didn't believe in softness. He believed in results, in numbers, in quarterly earnings that climbed higher than his competitors could reach. He fired executives who missed targets by 2%. He cut departments that didn't triple their efficiency year over year. He once told a reporter that empathy was a luxury small businesses could afford. But corporations that wanted to dominate their markets needed something sharper. This morning, Richard was late for an 8 a.m. meeting with the board. His driver had taken a wrong turn. His coffee was cold. His assistant forgot to print the quarterly reports. Everything that could go wrong before the most important presentation of his fiscal year was spiraling out of control. When he stepped off the elevator onto the 53rd floor, his tie was crooked, his jaw was clenched, and his eyes were scanning for someone to blame. That's when he saw Margaret. She was on her hands and knees outside the boardroom, scrubbing a stain on the carpet where someone had spilled coffee the night before. Her cart was positioned carefully to one side so it wouldn't block the hallway. She worked quietly, methodically, the way she always did. Richard barely registered her presence. To him, she was an obstacle between his current position and the boardroom where 12 people who controlled his company's future were waiting. "Clean faster or you're fired," he barked, not even slowing his stride. The executives filing in behind him heard it. Margaret heard it. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd heard worse over 17 years. She'd been yelled at by junior analysts, stressed about deadlines, ignored by senior managers who didn't think cleaning staff deserved a good morning, and treated like furniture by people who had worked at the company for less time than it took her to learn all 7 floors of the building. But this was different. She slowly rose to her feet, knees protesting after decades of hard labor. She looked at Richard Caldwell for the first time that morning, really looked at him. and what she saw wasn't the billionaire CEO featured in business magazines. She saw a man who had forgotten something crucial. Richard had already turned away, striding toward the boardroom entrance. The executives behind him exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few looked down at their phones. One woman, the CFO, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Margaret reached into her cart and pulled out a simple manila folder. It was worn at the edges, held together with a rubber band. She'd carried it with her for 3 years, waiting for a moment that might never come. "Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, calm, and somehow louder than his shout had been. Richard stopped mid-stride. "Executives don't get interrupted by janitors. Board members don't wait for cleaning staff. $7 billion doesn't pause for someone who makes minimum wage." But he turned around anyway, irritation flashing across his face. "What?" he snapped. Margaret held out the folder. "I think you need to see this before your meeting." The boardroom had gone completely silent. 12 executives stood frozen, some halfway into their chairs, others clutching tablets and briefcases. They were all staring at the janitor holding a worn manila folder and the CEO whose face had gone from irritated to dangerously angry. "I don't have time for this," Richard said through clenched teeth. "You do," Margaret replied, "because what's in this folder is the reason your Q3 projections are off by 14%, and why your board is about to recommend replacing you." The air in the hallway changed instantly. Several executives took a step forward. The CFO's eyes widened. Richard's face went pale, then red. "How could you possibly—" "I've been cleaning this floor for 17 years, Margaret interrupted, her voice still calm, still steady. "I've emptied your trash bins at midnight when you're working late. I've vacuumed under desks where people leave printouts they think no one will see. I've wiped whiteboards that still have numbers visible if you know how to look. And I've listened to conversations people have when they forget I'm in the room." She walked forward and placed the folder on the nearest desk. "I'm not fired, Mr. Caldwell, but you might be if you don't read this in the next 5 minutes. Then she turned, gripped the handle of her cart, and walked away down the hall. 17 years earlier, Margaret Ellis had a different life. She had a corner office, a graduate degree in industrial engineering from MIT, and a promising career at one of the top manufacturing consultancies in Chicago. She analyzed supply chains for Fortune 500 companies. She identified inefficiencies that cost corporations millions. She was being fast-tracked for partner. Then her daughter got sick. Leukemia doesn't care about career trajectories. It doesn't wait for convenient timing. When Margaret's daughter Emma was diagnosed at age 6, Margaret's world narrowed to hospital rooms, treatment schedules, and insurance claim forms that never seemed to cover enough. She burned through her savings in 8 months. She took a leave of absence that became permanent when the medical bills kept climbing and climbing. Emma survived, thank God, but their old life didn't. By the time Emma went into remission, Margaret had been out of the corporate world too long. Her contacts had moved on. The consulting industry had changed. She was overqualified for entry-level positions and underqualified, after years away, for senior ones. She needed work that paid immediately, work with flexible hours so she could still take Emma to follow-up appointments, work that didn't require explaining the 3-year gap in her resume. So she took a job cleaning office buildings. She took the night shift when Emma could stay with her sister. She took the invisibility that came with janitorial work because invisibility, she learned, had certain advantages. People talk when they think no one important is listening. Richard Caldwell stood in the hallway holding the manila folder, his board meeting forgotten. The executives hovered nearby, whispering to each other, checking their watches, clearly uncomfortable but unable to leave. Inside the folder were 17 pages of handwritten notes, printouts, and photocopied documents. Margaret had assembled a complete forensic analysis of TechVantage's operational breakdown over the past 2 years, one that no consultant, no internal audit, and no executive team had managed to piece together. The first page detailed a pattern of waste in the facility's management budget. Over 18 months, the company had spent $2.3 million replacing equipment that didn't need replacing, using a contractor who happened to be owned by the brother-in-law of TechVantage's VP of Operations. Margaret had pulled the contractor's name from invoices in recycling bins. She'd noted the timing of the purchases, always just under the threshold requiring board approval. She'd even included the specifications of the equipment, demonstrating that cheaper, more efficient alternatives existed. The second section exposed a data leak. For 9 months, someone had been feeding proprietary information to TechVantage's largest competitor. Margaret had noticed that certain meetings were always followed, within 48 hours, by competitor announcements that seemed impossibly well-timed. She'd tracked which executives attended those meetings. She'd noted which one always stayed late afterward, using the copier when she was cleaning nearby. She'd retrieved documents from the recycling that should have been shredded, documents with handwritten notes in margins that matched the handwriting on birthday cards displayed in one executive's office. The third section was the most damaging. It outlined a systemic failure in TechVantage's customer service infrastructure that was causing subscription cancellations to spike. The problem wasn't with the product, it was with the support system that had been quietly understaffed for 2 years to meet cost-cutting targets. Margaret had assembled this by listening to stressed support managers talking in break rooms, by reading complaint emails that executives printed and threw away without responding, by noticing the pattern of coffee cups accumulating in the customer service department, a sign that people were working later and later to handle call volumes they couldn't keep up with. At the bottom of the last page, Margaret had written a single sentence in careful handwriting. These problems can be fixed, but not by people who don't see them. Richard read the folder 3 times. His hands trembled slightly on the third pass, though he kept his face neutral. Around him, executives had gone silent, sensing that something monumental was happening, but not understanding what. The CFO finally spoke. "Richard, the board is waiting." "Reschedule," Richard said quietly. "We can't reschedule a quarterly." "Reschedule it," he repeated, louder this time. Then he looked up from the folder, his face unreadable. "Where did the janitor go?" "I think she went to the break room on 52, someone offered. Richard didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs, dress shoes echoing in the concrete stairwell, loosening his tie as he descended. The executives watched him go, confused, anxious, whispering among themselves about what just happened. When Richard pushed open the door to the 52nd floor break room, he found Margaret sitting at a small table, eating a sandwich she'd packed from home. Her janitor's uniform was slightly damp where she'd been scrubbing floors. Her hands were wrinkled from cleaning solution. She looked up at him without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell," she said. For 17 years, people had given Richard Caldwell orders, but they were executives, board members, major shareholders. No one who made minimum wage had ever told him to sit down. He sat. "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice stripped of the arrogance from an hour earlier. "Margaret Ellis," she replied, taking another bite of her sandwich. "I've cleaned this building since 2009. Before that, I was a senior consultant at Morrison & Clark in Chicago, industrial engineering, supply chain optimization, operational efficiency. I analyzed companies like yours for 12 years before my daughter got sick and I had to walk away. Richard stared at her, processing. You have an MIT degree and you've been cleaning toilets for 17 years? My daughter has a life because I cleaned toilets for 17 years, Margaret corrected quietly. I have insurance through this job. I have hours that let me be there for her appointments. I have work that doesn't follow me home at night when she needs me. It's honest work, Mr. Caldwell. There's no shame in it except the shame people like you assign to it. The words hung between them like smoke. Richard felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It might have been shame, it might have been recognition. Whatever it was, he didn't like it. The information in this folder, he said slowly, is worth millions. Why didn't you bring it to me before? Why wait until I was about to walk into the most important board meeting of the year? Margaret set down her sandwich and looked at him directly. I tried, Mr. Caldwell. 3 years ago, I sent an email to your assistant explaining that I'd noticed discrepancies in contractor billing. She never responded. 2 years ago, I left a note with your security detail about the data leak. It never reached you. Last year, I approached your VP of Operations directly about the customer service staffing crisis. He laughed and asked why a janitor was giving business advice. She paused, letting that sink in. So I waited, she continued. I waited until you were desperate enough to listen, until you were vulnerable enough to see past the uniform and the cart and the invisibility you've assigned to people like me. I waited until you had no choice but to pay attention. Richard felt something crack inside his carefully constructed armor. He'd built an empire by being smarter, faster, more ruthless than anyone else. He'd believed that strength meant never showing weakness, that leadership meant never admitting mistakes, that success meant never looking back at who you'd stepped on climbing to the top. But sitting across from Margaret Ellis in a break room that he'd never visited in the 17 years his company occupied this building, Richard realized he'd been wrong about something fundamental. I threatened to fire you this morning, he said quietly. Yes, you did. I've treated you like you're invisible. Yes, you have. Margaret's voice was steady, factual, not accusing. Somehow that made it worse. I don't even know if I've ever said good morning to you in 17 years. You haven't, Margaret confirmed. But 90% of your executives haven't either. You're not unique in that, Mr. Caldwell. You're just the most powerful person who does it, which means you set the tone for everyone else. Richard looked down at the folder still clutched in his hands. 17 pages of careful analysis, gathered over years by someone he'd never bothered to see. Information that could save his company, delivered by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant. What do you want? He asked. Money? A position? I can offer you. Margaret held up a hand, stopping him. I don't want your job, Mr. Caldwell. I like my life. I like my hours. I like that I can pick up my daughter from college when she needs me, that I can be there for her still, that my work is straightforward and honest and done at the end of my shift. Then what? Richard asked, genuinely confused. Why give this to me? Why help a company run by someone who's been cruel to you? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Because I remember being where you are. I remember believing that efficiency mattered more than people. I remember thinking that the higher you climbed, the less you needed to acknowledge the people below you holding the ladder steady. And then my daughter got sick, and I fell all the way down. and I learned that the people you don't see are the people who actually keep everything running. She gestured toward the folder. That information doesn't exist because I'm smarter than your executives, Mr. Caldwell. It exists because I'm invisible to them. People talk freely around me. They throw away documents without thinking. They assume I can't read them, or won't understand them, or don't matter enough to care what I know, but I see everything. I hear everything. And I remember what it feels like to be invisible. So this is revenge? Richard asked. No, Margaret said firmly. This is a mirror. You threatened to fire me this morning for cleaning too slowly. But the real question is, what are you willing to fire yourself for? For not seeing the waste bankrupting your facility's budget? For not noticing the spy leaking your proprietary data? For not listening when your customer service department has been screaming for help for 2 years? Those failures are yours, Mr. Caldwell. I'm just the person who bothered to notice them while emptying your trash. For the first time in perhaps decades, Richard Caldwell felt small, not small in authority or wealth or power, but small in the way that matters, small in understanding, in awareness, in basic human decency. He thought about the 12 executives waiting upstairs, all of them college-educated, well-compensated, precisely chosen for their expertise. None of them had seen what Margaret saw. None of them had assembled what she'd assembled. They were too busy competing with each other, too focused on their individual departmental targets, too wrapped up in the politics of corporate hierarchy to notice the patterns that someone invisible could see clearly. The board is going to ask for my resignation today, Richard said slowly. The numbers are bad, the trend lines are worse. They've already been talking to potential replacements. I know, Margaret replied. I heard the board chair talking to your COO last week in the executive lounge. I was restocking paper towels. They didn't notice me. Can this be fixed? Richard asked, gesturing to the folder. The contractor fraud can be fixed by firing your VP of operations and renegotiating the facility's contracts. That's a 6-month process, but it'll save you $2 million annually. The data leak can be fixed by letting your head of strategic planning go and implementing a document control system. That's immediate damage control, though your competitor already has a year's worth of information. The customer service crisis requires hiring 12 new support staff and restructuring your workflow protocols. That's a 3-month implementation that'll cost you $400,000, but save you $8 million in subscription renewals. Margaret recited the numbers from memory with the precision of someone who'd spent years analyzing exactly these kinds of problems in her previous life. Richard stared at her. You know exactly what needs to be done. I told you, Mr. Caldwell. Industrial engineering, supply chain optimization. I may be cleaning floors now, but I still know how to fix broken systems. The real question is whether you're capable of listening to someone you've been trained to dismiss. Richard stood abruptly, pacing the small break room like a caged animal. He'd spent 17 years building TechVantage on a foundation of aggressive decision-making, relentless efficiency, and unwavering confidence. He'd fired people for hesitating. He'd rewarded ruthlessness. He'd created a culture where strength meant never showing weakness, and leadership meant never admitting mistakes. And now a janitor, a woman he'd threatened to fire an hour ago, was showing him that every principle he'd built his empire on was fundamentally flawed. If I go back up there, Richard said slowly, and I present this information to the board, they're going to ask where it came from. Yes, Margaret agreed. If I tell them it came from a janitor who used to be a consultant and has been gathering intelligence while cleaning the building, they're going to wonder why I didn't know any of this. They're going to question my leadership. Yes, Margaret said again. They're going to wonder how the CEO of a $7 billion technology company was completely blind to operational failures that the woman who empties his trash noticed immediately. Richard stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "Why are you doing this to me?" "I'm not doing it to you, Mr. Caldwell. I'm offering you a choice. You can walk back upstairs and present this information as if you discovered it through your own analysis. You can take credit, fire the people who need to be fired, implement the fixes, and save your position. Your board will think you're brilliant for identifying these problems. No one needs to know a janitor handed you the solution." "Or?" Richard asked. "Or," Margaret continued, her voice quiet but firm, "you can walk back upstairs and tell them the truth. You can admit that the most valuable intelligence your company has received in the last 2 years came from someone invisible to your entire executive team. You can acknowledge that the culture you've created rewards people for looking up toward promotions instead of around at the systems they're supposed to be managing. You can admit that you've failed as a leader not because you lack intelligence or drive, but because you've forgotten that every person in your organization matters, from the executives in the boardroom to the woman cleaning the floors after they've gone home." Richard felt his throat tighten. "That's career suicide." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe it's the first honest thing you've done in years." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Through the window, Richard could see the city spread out below, 53 floors of people working, striving, competing, most of them invisible to each other, in the same way Margaret had been invisible to him. Richard Caldwell returned to the 53rd floor 20 minutes later. The 12 executives were still waiting, now openly anxious, checking phones, debating whether to call building security. The board chair, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Jennings, stood with her arms crossed, clearly furious at the delay. "Richard, this is unacceptable," she began. "I need to say something before we start this meeting," Richard interrupted. He held up Margaret's folder. "And I need you all to hear it." He told them everything. He told them about the contractor fraud, the data leak, the customer service crisis. He walked them through Margaret's analysis, explaining each problem and each solution with the clarity of someone who'd finally had his eyes opened. The executives listened with growing alarm, checking their own departments, realizing their blind spots. Then Richard did something none of them expected. "This information," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its usual arrogance, "didn't come from our executive team. It did not come from consultants or auditors or internal analysis. It came from Margaret Ellis, who has cleaned this building for 17 years and who I threatened to fire this morning for working too slowly." The silence was absolute. "Margaret has an MIT degree in industrial engineering," Richard continued. "She was a senior consultant before circumstances forced her into a different life. And for 17 years, she has been invisible to all of us, myself included, even as she watched our company hemorrhage money and competitive advantage because we were too arrogant to see the problems right in front of us." Patricia Jennings found her voice first. "You're telling us that a janitor identified operational failures that our entire executive team missed?" "I'm telling you," Richard replied, his voice quiet but firm, "that we've built a culture where people are trained not to see anyone beneath them on the organizational chart. And because of that, we've been blind to problems that someone invisible could see clearly." He set the folder on the conference table. "I deserve to be fired, not for the operational failures, those can be fixed, but for creating an environment where the most valuable intelligence our company could receive had to wait 3 years for me to be desperate enough to listen." What happened next surprised everyone, including Richard. Patricia Jennings picked up the folder, read through it carefully, then looked at Richard with an expression he couldn't quite read. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, thoughtful. "I've been on this board for 6 years," she said. "In that time, I've never heard a CEO admit fault this directly. Most would have taken this information, presented it as their own discovery, and moved on without acknowledgement." She paused. "The fact that you didn't tells me something about whether you're capable of change." The board meeting lasted 4 hours. They discussed each issue in Margaret's folder. They called in department heads. They demanded explanations. The VP of Operations was fired before lunch. The head of strategic planning resigned by afternoon. By the end of the day, TechVantage had implemented emergency protocols to address the customer service crisis and hired a forensic accounting firm to audit all contractor relationships. Richard kept his position, but barely. The board put him on a 90-day performance review and assigned Patricia as executive oversight. If the operational fixes didn't take hold, he'd be out. But something else happened that day, something that mattered more than Richard's career. The next morning, Richard Caldwell arrived at TechVantage Tower at 5:45 a.m. He took the elevator to the lobby where Margaret was beginning her shift, loading her cart with supplies. When she saw him, she paused, waiting. "I owe you an apology," Richard said simply. "Not just for yesterday, but for 17 years of not seeing you, for creating a workplace where people like you are invisible, for believing that efficiency mattered more than basic human dignity." Margaret studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, accepting. "I'm making changes," Richard continued. "I'm implementing a new company policy. Every executive, starting with me, will spend 1 week per quarter working alongside staff in non-executive roles, facilities management, customer service, IT support, wherever people are actually doing the work that keeps this company running. I want my leadership team to understand what they've been trained not to see." "That's a good start," Margaret said carefully. "I'm also creating a new position," Richard added. "Director of Operational Intelligence. It's a senior role reporting directly to me, responsible for identifying systemic inefficiencies and cultural blind spots. The salary is $250,000 plus full benefits. The position is yours if you want it." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Caldwell, but like I told you yesterday, I like my life. I like my hours. I like work that ends when my shift ends, so I can be there for my daughter." Richard felt something sink in his chest, disappointment maybe, or recognition that money couldn't fix everything he'd broken. But Margaret wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "I know someone who'd be perfect for the role. My daughter, Emma. She just finished her MBA at Stanford with a focus on organizational behavior. She's brilliant, she's principled, and she grew up watching me work in environments where I was invisible. She understands what you're trying to fix, and she won't let you backslide." Richard smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in recent memory. "Have her send me her resume." "I'll do better than that," Margaret replied. "I'll bring her by next week, but fair warning, Mr. Caldwell. She's even less impressed by billionaires than I am. If you try to intimidate her the way you tried to intimidate me, she'll tear apart your company culture in ways that'll make my folder look gentle." "Good," Richard said quietly. "That's exactly what we need." Emma Ellis started as Director of Operational Intelligence in March. By June, she'd implemented systems that identified communication breakdowns between departments, created feedback channels for non-executive staff, and restructured meeting protocols to include perspectives from every level of the organization. Customer service staffing was restored. Subscription renewals climbed. The data leak was contained, though the damage to competitive advantage took longer to repair. Most significantly, TechVantage began developing a reputation in the industry as a company that valued its people, not just executives, but everyone who contributed to its success. Richard never forgot the morning Margaret handed him that folder. He kept it in his desk drawer as a reminder of how close he'd come to destroying everything he'd built, not through bad business decisions, but through fundamental failures of character. He also never forgot to say good morning to the people who kept his building clean, who answered support calls, who worked security desks and maintained servers and restocked supplies. It became habit, then culture, then something that new employees noticed immediately about TechVantage, a company where the CEO learned people's names regardless of their titles. Margaret continued cleaning the 53rd floor. She liked the quiet hours, the satisfaction of visible progress, the simplicity of work that ended when she pushed her cart back to the supply closet. But now, when executives passed her in hallways, they stopped. They asked about her daughter. They thanked her for her work. They saw her. And that, Margaret thought, mattered more than any corporate title ever could. 2 years after the folder incident, TechVantage released its annual report. Revenue had climbed to $9.2 billion. Customer satisfaction ratings reached industry-leading levels. Employee retention improved by 38%. Business analysts credited Richard's operational reforms and cultural restructuring. Richard credited Margaret. In his letter to shareholders, he wrote, "The most valuable lesson I've learned as CEO is that the people you don't see are often the people holding your organization together. True leadership requires looking beyond organizational charts and recognizing that every person contributes to our success. This year's achievements reflect not just strategic decisions from the executive team, but the dedication, insight, and expertise of every individual at TechVantage, from our senior vice presidents to the people who clean our offices after we've gone home." The letter was unusual for a corporate document. It was honest, vulnerable, and clearly written by someone who'd learned something painful. When reporters asked about it during earnings calls, Richard told them Margaret's story, not all of it, respecting her privacy, but enough to make the point clear. Within 6 months, 3 other Fortune 500 CEOs reached out to Richard privately, asking how he'd implemented his cultural reforms. Within a year, business schools were teaching case studies about TechVantage's transformation. Within 2 years, operational invisibility became an industry term for the systemic failure to recognize contributions from non-executive staff. Margaret watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. She never gave interviews. She never sought recognition. She continued her shifts, continued her routine, continued being present for her daughter, who thrived in her role, who pushed executives uncomfortable with being questioned, who made sure her mother's insights about invisibility were never forgotten. But the moment that mattered most, the one Richard thought about during difficult decisions, the one that fundamentally changed how he understood leadership, was still that morning in the hallway outside the boardroom. He remembered the weight of Margaret's folder in his hands. He remembered the sick feeling of realizing he'd been completely blind to problems destroying his company. He remembered most of all the way Margaret had looked at him when he sat down across from her in that break room, not with anger or resentment, but with something that might have been pity. She'd seen him clearly in that moment, perhaps more clearly than anyone had in years. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the Forbes profile or the quarterly earnings report. Just a man who'd forgotten how to see people. That clarity, painful, uncomfortable, necessary, was what saved him. Not the information in the folder, though that helped, not the operational fixes, though those mattered. But the willingness to admit that he'd failed at something fundamental, that success in business didn't excuse failure in basic humanity, that the higher you climbed, the more essential it became to remember the people holding the ladder steady. Years later, when Richard retired and Emma took over as CEO, the first former janitor's daughter to lead a Fortune 500 technology company, reporters asked him what his greatest achievement had been. They expected him to talk about revenue, market share, innovation, competitive dominance. Instead, Richard smiled and said, "Learning to see the people I'd been trained to ignore. Everything else came from that." Margaret Ellis retired at 67 after 25 years of cleaning Tech Vantage Tower. Her retirement party was held in the executive boardroom, the same room where Richard had once barked at her to clean faster. Every executive attended. Patricia Jennings gave a speech about how Margaret had saved the company. Emma presented her with a plaque that read, "The most valuable contributions are often invisible until someone takes the time to look." Margaret's final act before leaving was to train her replacement, a young man named Daniel, who was putting himself through engineering school. She showed him every corner of the 53rd floor, explained every quirk of the building, taught him which executives liked their coffee rooms cleaned first, and which windows got the worst morning glare. She also told him, quietly, that his position was more important than any executive would probably tell him, that people talked when they thought no one was listening, that the person who seemed invisible often saw the most clearly, that kindness, dignity, and careful observation mattered more than titles or salaries. But most importantly, Margaret said on her last night, showing Daniel how to properly clean the boardroom's glass walls, "Remember that you matter. Your work matters. The executives in this room can't do what they do without people like us making sure the building runs smoothly. Never let anyone make you feel invisible because you're not. You're essential." Daniel nodded, unsure if he fully understood. He'd learn, Margaret thought. Over time, working quietly while people around him talked as if he weren't there, he'd learn what she'd learned, that being underestimated could be a strength, that invisibility offered perspective, that the people at the bottom often understood systems better than the people at the top. Margaret pushed her cart out of Tech Vantage Tower for the last time just before dawn. The building was silent except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of early traffic. She paused at the lobby doors, looking back at the tower that had been her workplace for a quarter-century. She thought about that morning years ago when Richard Caldwell barked at her to clean faster, when she'd made the choice to hand him the folder instead of letting him fail, when she'd offered him a mirror instead of revenge. She'd wondered, in that moment, if it would change anything. If one powerful man learning to see one invisible woman would matter in any lasting way. Looking back now, watching the lights flicker on as early executives arrived for their day, Margaret knew the answer. Change was slow, incremental, imperfect, but it was real. And it started with the simplest choice: to see people you'd been trained to ignore, to listen to voices you'd been taught didn't matter, to recognize that everyone's contribution was essential. That lesson, hard-won and painfully learned, was worth more than any quarterly earnings report. Margaret pushed through the doors into the grey morning light, thinking about her daughter leading board meetings upstairs, about Daniel beginning his first solo shift, about Richard Caldwell learning, after decades of ruthless efficiency, that the most important metric wasn't quarterly growth, it was how many people you helped see clearly along the way. The work continued. The building would be cleaned tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Executives would have their meetings, deals would be made, numbers would climb or fall. But somewhere in the machinery of corporate success, There were now people who understood that the janitor mattered just as much as the CEO, that invisibility was a failure of the observer rather than the observed, and that true leadership began with the simple act of seeing. That understanding, Margaret thought as she walked toward the bus stop in the early morning light, was the real legacy. Not the operational fixes or the improved earnings or the industry case studies, just the recognition that every person deserves to be seen, and that sometimes the people you overlook are the ones who save you. Thanks for watching to the end of this story. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.